In many ways, the American wilderness was the birthplace of the weird. Fay Ringel speaks of the first Puritans arriving in the New World and encountering the Native American, the dark other, who became the paradigm for all that is diabolical and mysterious. Our colonial ancestors trekking across a rugged frontier, removed and remote from the civilities of European culture, fostering the emergence of witchcraft, which, if not transferred from England, at least found a healthy renaissance in this remote, desolate corner of the world. And of course, psycho-projecting all the werebeasts, water serpents, and ghostly tuplas, which excited the popular imagination at the time. In this context, American literature was born, a hauntingly puritanical gothic phenomena which has its roots in American colonialism and which undergoes a rich consummation under the dark auspices of Hawthorne and Melville. Lovecraft clearly demonstrates all of these proclivities and inherits his own peculiarly puritanical cosmic consciousness, which is the inheritance of the Michael Wigglesworths and Jonathan Edwards of colonial literature. Perry Miller aptly speaks of the Puritans' errand in the wilderness, the agonistic attempt to establish a new Jerusalem, a new Israel that will definitively establish the kingdom of God on earth and usher in the second coming. From Puritan literature up until the American Renaissance, the American literary identity is heavily indebted to the archetypal image of the new Adam, as noted by R.B. Lewis, a Trahernian man who seeks to erect a paradise in the wilderness, psychodramatically as well as topologically. In this respect of all English poets, Milton, ironically, is the most American, an observation made by Margaret Fuller herself. Such a pronouncement may seem a bit anachronistic at first, but Milton is the purest and most ascetic of English poets in his aspiration to transcend to, or at least transition from, a nationalistic to a universal mode of monomythic consciousness, seeking, like the American Puritan, to raise his own Eden in the waste wilderness, as he pronounces at the opening of Book 1 of Paradise Regained. For Milton, there was no matter of Britain to spark his poetical imagination, no Nine Worthies, Arthurian romance, chivalric quest, or dramatic Henriette to applaud, whereas Dante's Divine Comedy always keeps the reader in mind of medieval Italy. Milton's epic tragedies are as removed and remote from Tennysonian British nationalism as the Puritan poets were from the Cavaliers. In fact, as George Senzaba aptly reminds us in Milton in early America, the Puritan settlers crossed over to the New World with their two most prized possessions, the English Bible and the poetry of Milton. Yes, Shakespeare came along too, and as always was poet premier on and off the continent. But it was Milton who lit the spark for a new national consciousness, a new missionistic undertaking. Milton provided the Puritan psyche with a monolithic and megalomaniacal sense of high vocation. Without Milton, there probably would have been no Ahabian Satan, unlike Shakespeare's problematic and at times protean sense of purposeless morality. I would like to argue for Milton and Lovecraft as desert poets in the ancient tradition of the Desert Fathers. Both sought a sense of spiritual isolation, a removal from the quotidian concerns of secularity, and both purposely sought an active engagement with those dark forces which threatened to ravage the human psyche. Their prose and poetry seem to be a variation of St. Athanasius' epic on the life of St. Anthony of the Desert, a gladiatorial wrestling match with invasive diabolical hordes of non-human entities infesting inner and outer space. Prophetically, Milton both anticipates invasion literature as well as perfects the captivity narrative. Milton's Hebraic consciousness as another David seeking to bring down a Goliath, or as a Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord, is all part of his Mosaic, Abrahamic, and Messianic identity. Another founder and deliverer of a renegade people in need of liberation, and which is much closer to the early American spirit than the Shakespearean ethos could ever be. For Lovecraft, such an enterprise is part of his Puritan heritage as well, yet doomed to failure, since in the Lovecraftian world resistance is ultimately futile, but not without its own sense of interior merit. Lovecraft cannot fully interiorize puritanical self-ascendancy, psychical victory, in the wake of certain defeat, in the same way that Milton can, nor come out of the scathing interior inferno whole but undiminished, shivered but steadfast. The Philistine Dagon that Milton's Samson inevitably overthrows by being overthrown himself and thereby releasing the Israelites from their captivity, is the very same Dagon that ultimately hurls the Lovecraftian narrator out a window to his horrific end, but without the benefit of both a private and public salvific liberation. Samson's descent is his ascent, whereas the Lovecraftian protagonist's descent results only in his definitive demise. Two Agons with two very different outcomes. To speak, therefore, of Milton and Lovecraft as desert poets is to speak of a patristic tradition of self-imposed isolation, spiritual agons, and interiorized psychomachias of heart and mind. Milton and Lovecraft both relentlessly espouse such convictions of reality, each committed to a supernal vision of human destiny and identity, albeit on two diverging ends of the cosmic spectrum, divine consummation versus infernal conflagration. But in the midst of such aridity, primal simplicity, commitment to interior truth, and otherworldly visitations impel the Desert Father. And it is this very same simplicity and commitment to the primacy of supernal living that compelled both Milton and Lovecraft to seek newer, other, and stranger worlds. Milton frequently speaks of himself as a poet-prophet, bent on a high vocation and awaiting the fulfillment of his destiny. But this does not negate Milton's sense of aloneness, his solitariness in inhabiting an alien world, his sense of psychic, if not historical, displacement. Although Dante is typically seen as a poet of exile, expelled from his native homeland and forced into literal banishment, Milton's sense of dislocation is no less severe. In lieu of geographical relocation, Milton inhabits a totally etheric space, allowing him to undergo a hermeneutical and hermetic journey of self-transcendence and self-dejection, much like Dante traversing his own diabolical and celestial hierarchies of the mind. Nowhere is this more clearly stated than in Milton's familial lamentations. I am accustomed, Milton says, in very frequent grieving over my own lot, the sense, namely, that those whom the mere necessity of neighborhood, or something else of a useless kind, has closely conjoined with me, whether by accident or by the tie of law, they are the persons, though in no other respect commendable, who sit daily in my company, weary me, nay, by heaven, all but plague me to death, whenever they are jointly in the humor for it. Whereas those whom habits, disposition, studies, had so handsomely made my friends, are now almost denied me, either by death or by most unjust separation of place, and are so for the most part snatched from my sight, that I have to live well nigh in a perpetual solitude. John Milton, trapped in a world he never made. In The Exorcist, the demon Pazuzu is probably very right when he accuses Father Merrin of being proud, but he is also at the same time very wrong, since he doesn't know that Merrin spent all that time in the desert learning humility. Blatty's Merrin reminisces at the beginning of the novel about how at one time he wouldn't have been able to love a certain kind of man. Milton, like Merrin, like the French Jesuit philosopher, paleontologist, and priest Teilhard de Chardin, on whom Merrin is based, like Thomas Merton, who spoke of constantly becoming a new man, and like all the Desert Fathers preceding him, fled to the desert to escape a full sense of self, a full sense of entitlement, a full sense of ego, and to learn in their place lowliness, meekness, and transparency. And judging from Milton's complaint about his familial relationships, Milton at 39 years of age is still very far from being perfected. Although Lovecraft is consistently viewed as an outsider artist, a term coined by Thomas Ligotti, Lovecraft as monastic artist suggests the habitation of an inner space unmolested by and immune to socio-political as well as intrusively cultural conditioning. Lovecraft, according to Donald Tyson, had for many years been living the life of an ascetic. He had withdrawn from society, avoided crowds, spent most of his time in solitary study, and ate only enough food to keep his body functioning. Neither smoked or drank, and his sexual life was non-existent. In effect, he was living the life of a virtuous medieval monk without the burden of religious dogma. It is possible that his ascetic lifestyle, coupled with sexual abstinence, awoke in Lovecraft spontaneous spiritual manifestations of the body that are recognized in various Eastern religious and philosophic disciplines. Milton, too, in his youth, sought to fulfill the promise of a biblical heritage. His early poems speak of his refraining from imbibing the fruit of the vine in favor of the clear elixir of water, the true tonic for a prospective epic poet, but also in keeping with his archetypal pattern hero, Samson, who was bound to fulfill his Nazarite covenant by abstaining from the grape, as well as by keeping his locks unshorn. Milton, like his Adam and his archangels, kept his hair at shoulder's length as well. Milton and Lovecraft's asceticism was closely knit to their aestheticism, each voluntarily inducing, or in Milton's case involuntarily, with respect to his blindness, some form of sense deprivation in order to achieve an altered state of consciousness, a potential catalyst that could trigger a heightened sense of interior awareness. Paul Rowland posits an alternative approach to Lovecraft's self-professed secularism. Although he proclaimed himself a rationalist and professed disbelief in the supernatural, Lovecraft entertained the idea that writers and artists can develop an acute, even psychic sensitivity to the other realities or dimensions through the development of their imagination, and so be able to access the symbolic landscape of these inner worlds of the psyche, in which their fears could take on form, fears which were to haunt him through his brief, unhappy life. Although Miltonic and Lovecraftian narratives involve a wrestling with diabolical presences, a close engagement, no quarter-given encounter, with outer monstrosities laying siege to the protagonist's physical and psychical life, it should be noted that an agonistic escalation also unfolds in the chronological progression and maturation of both Milton and Lovecraft's literary development. The outer darkness, although still all-encompassing, can be resisted and a temporary respite obtained. Beginning with Dr. Willett's successful exorcism of the spirit of Joseph Curwen in The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward, to Dr. Henry Armitage's equally successful excisory incantation against Wilbur Whately's twin brother in The Dunwich Horror, to Henry Ackley and his dog's valiant but doomed resistance under siege in The Whisperer in the Darkness, to Joseph Mazurowitz, who, regardless of his psychological predispositions, does comprehend the efficacy of the crucifix in keeping Keziah Mason at bay, leading up to Through the Gates of the Silver Key, where various avatars of Randolph Carter inhabiting multitudinous multiverses serve as guardians of the galaxies, to finally The Haunter in the Dark, where the townsfolk keeping a candlelit vigil are proactively and prayerfully besieging the diabolically infested former church of starry wisdom. Lovecraft's protagonists adopt a more adversarial attitude in the face of incalculable odds. Representatively, in a letter to August Derleth, Lovecraft admits that while writing The Dunwich Horror, I found myself identifying with one of the characters, an AIDS scholar who finally combats the menace toward the end. Lovecraft has come a long way from the futility of human resistance since the Call of Cthulhu. So too with Milton. From his elegy Lycidas, where Edward King becomes a guardian oceanic spirit, the demiurgic protector of the shore after his own untimely demise at sea, to the Lady in Comus, who, though successful in abstaining from Comus's sexual inducements in the woods, must still rely upon Sabrina, an agent of divine grace, to release her from her captivity, to the great epic Paradise Lost, where we witness God for man, releasing Adam and Eve from the shackles of despair in the promise of a future Messiah, to the even greater epic, at least in Milton's estimation, of Paradise Regained, where God as man, through psychic engagement with the adversary, much like Algernon Blackwood's occult detective John Silence, minus the godhood, overcomes the source of all evil and fortifies human resistance against any future diabolical threat of incursion. To Milton's own final pronouncement on self-realization, the tragedy Samson Agonistes, where God in man assists the biblical Hercules in triumphing over his own desert despair, and when, to quote Milton's God from Paradise Lost, the easier conquest against Philistine yoke. God the Father for man, God the Son as man, and God the Holy Spirit in man epitomize Milton's triadic, triumphant, and Trinitarian poetics. Ironically, after the dream quest of an unknown Kadath, the Lovecraftian protagonist, as noted before, seems more determined, more committed, and resilient. There seems to be a growing sense of deliberate and purposeful orientation against the encompassing shadows, either by particular mentoristic sages who rise to the occasion, or by the citizenry themselves, as in Lovecraft's last tale, the shadow out of darkness. Defeat does not seem so imminent, nor the protagonist so desperate. There is momentary relief, a lull in the storm, temporary but tenable. Darkness may have the final say, but a rising crescendo of resistant voices attempt to drive out and away cacophonies from beyond or below the stars. In conclusion, Lovecraft is incrementally and progressively approximating something akin to the heroic. It may not be Robert E. Howard's vision of stolid, atavistic, defiant primitivism, but it does echo a measured, tempered, and intelligently interior line of demarcation, where the Lovecraftian, much like the Miltonic hero, must take a stand and keep oneself in a constant state of vigilant readiness. At the end of the 1951 version of The Thing from Another World, journalist Ned Scott broadcasts the warning, "Tell the world, tell this to everybody, wherever they are. Watch the skies everywhere. Keep looking, keep watching the skies." Milton and Lovecraft both supremely understood the efficacy of standing and watching. Thank you.